An interesting year for the Clemson Tigers. They found a way into the ACC championship, obviously needed a little help, and now they find themselves ACC champions once again, and they're in the college football playoff. They are going to face the Texas Longhorns, and today we're going to take a look at how they beat that Texas team on the road. Dabo Swinney has done a really good job of getting his team to bounce back. A tough loss to Georgia to start the year. You also have the loss to Louisville. That was obviously a very disappointing loss, one in which I think a lot of people counted the Tigers out for the ACC, but also for the rest of college football. Then you lose to South Carolina to end the year, and granted that didn't affect your ACC status, but I think that the vibes in Clemson were very much down. And then Miami loses and gets Clemson in, and then they win an absolute thriller of a game against SMU. It's going to be fun to see how they do in the postseason now. They weren't really expected to be here, and now they suddenly find themselves in this position. They're the 12 seed, they're taking on the 5 seed, and it'll be interesting to see how they do against this team. It's not an unbeatable team in Texas, so there's definitely ways that this Clemson team can find a way to win, and that's what we're going to dive into today. Clemson is 10-3. They find themselves though as an 11-point underdog as the time I'm recording this, so that's definitely something that could be a little bit of a challenge for them to overcome. How do they find ways to get those points back? And that kind of leads us into the keys to the game. This is a team that really needs its offense to play really well. Obviously, the defense needs to do its part against that Texas offense. But we'll start with this. Cade Klubnik's rhythm. That's a big thing. We saw it in the first half against SMU. You saw a very confident Cade Klubnik. You saw a very explosive offense in the Clemson Tigers, and that's not something we've seen consistently this year. They need that to happen against this Texas team. This is a Texas defense that is loaded with talent, and you need to find ways to create explosive plays. You're going to have to find Cade Klubnik opportunities to move the ball down the field through the air and give Phil Maffa some room to run. Because if you're not, we've seen what Texas can do against an offense that is relatively predictable, or they're just absolutely dominating on the line of scrimmage, which leads us to the second point. You have to be physical up front, both offensively and defensively. I think this is a defensive line in the Clemson Tigers that is very slept on, and it's a group that, in years past, we've seen really good Clemson defensive lines, and I don't think that this group is much different. It just maybe doesn't have the star power that we once expected from this team. That being said, there's a ton of talent on this defensive line. TJ Parker's having a really good year. Peter Woods is that versatile weapon for them, a big body that can do a lot of damage, and you're going to need both of them to step up in a big way. And that's not just those two, but other people up front, the linebackers as well. There's plenty of opportunities for guys to step up and make big plays, but you have to be physical up front. Same with the offensive line. This Texas defensive line is no joke. Linebackers are good as well. So the fact that you go against that type of a group in practice almost prepares Clemson really well for this matchup. Now, I do think that Texas's defensive line is a little bit better and something that they haven't seen in terms of the level of elite play you see. That's going to be a challenge. And Clemson's offensive line, if you want to do the first key to the game, you have to be physical up front. You have to give Phil Maffa room to run. You have to give Cade Klubnik time to throw. And from there, you're kind of just waiting for them to make explosive plays and see what happens at that point. I think you also have to keep the Texas Longhorns' speed in check. This is a team that has a ton of offense that is really fast and really explosive at multiple different positions. Matthew Golden is their leading receiver. Isaiah Bond, when he's healthy, is explosive. Ryan Wingo has been really good as a freshman. DeAndre Moore, they've combined for over 2,000 yards and 21 touchdowns this year, and it's because their speed makes things very difficult for the teams that they face. Now you throw in Jaden Blue as a running back who has plenty of speed, and you're worried about a ton of talent for the Texas Longhorns. That is something you have to keep in front of you. Fundamentally sound football, play your gap, wrap up, tackle, take guys to the ground. Don't miss tackles. Don't allow them to create space. That's going to be a big thing for this Clemson Tigers team, and that's going to be a really big key for them if they want to win this football game. And that's something that Clemson has seen at certain teams this year, but I don't know if they've necessarily seen the type of speed outside of, obviously, the Georgia game. I don't think they've seen that for a while. And that is something that maybe takes a little bit of time to get used to, but it's definitely something that you can figure out how do you contain that. And some of these players that we'll talk about here now are going to play big roles in that. And Clemson has some really good players. And again, Clemson is kind of in that underdog role. And it starts with their quarterback. Cade Klubnik is one of those guys that for a lot of people, you kind of forgotten about him because of some of the inconsistent play. I think a lot of people forgot about Clemson after they lost to Georgia. And I don't really blame them because when you look at what happened, a 34-3 loss is not a good way to start the season. And I think that a lot of people forgot about the Clemson Tigers. The Louisville loss certainly didn't put them back on anybody's radar for sure, or if they were on their radar, probably pushed them off of it. So Cade Klubnik has a big opportunity in this game, not only for his career, but also for the Clemson Tigers. And it's going to be fun to see how he performs in this game. And Cade at times has looked kind of honestly a little bit scared in certain games, but also you've seen him build some confidence later in the season, and it'll be fun to see how Garrett Riley puts him in position to move the ball down the field, to get his offense in explosive situations. I think that the talent is still there. It's just finding the right rhythm and figuring that out, going back to our keys of the game. Phil Maffa, a very physical running back, having a pretty solid year, over 1,100 yards, 8 touchdowns, a guy who has been really the consistent force for this offense and someone who definitely has the ability to really set the tone for this team early, finding ways to move the ball down the field, not just through the air, but on the ground. A guy who's averaging 5.2 yards per carry is someone you want to get involved in that game plan. And Tony Williams is someone who has been, again, we're talking about under the radar, which feels weird for the Clemson Tigers, but when you only have 838 yards and 10 touchdowns receiving, not a lot of people are going to talk about you. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because Antonio Williams is extremely talented, but you're not going to get the recognition as some of these other players. But that's almost good. I think Dabo's kind of realizing we can embrace this underdog role. We're not a team that wants to be an underdog, but this is a unique situation that we can really buy in. People are really counting us out. How do we find ways to channel that underdog energy and find a way to pull off an upset here? The defense is going to have their hands full. And I think that there's a blueprint for how you slow down Texas. And a familiar opponent, the Georgia Bulldogs, have provided kind of that blueprint for how do you make Quinn Ewers uncomfortable? How do you make him worry about what's going to happen? How do you get pressure on him? How do you give different looks? And that's going to be a big key. This defense has plenty of talent to make that happen, and that's a matchup that I really like if you're looking at it from the Clemson perspective. If you're looking at it from their perspective of how do we pull off the upset here, how do we find a way to win, again, it all starts up front. We talked about TJ Parker, Peter Woods. Those are two guys that are going to set the tone up front for that group. Barrett Carter, Sammy Brown, those are linebackers that have done a really good job this year, and they are extremely talented. The secondary also have lots of options, but at the same time, you do have to worry about that talent for Texas. And that's going to be something they know. That's not new information. They're going to be game planning for that. They have multiple weeks to prepare for what Texas is going to bring to the table. You know they're going to watch both Georgia games to see what did Georgia do to slow down this Texas offense. Now, the players to watch for Texas, this is what Clemson is going to be focusing on. Who do you have to prepare for? And it starts with the quarterback position. You have to prepare for both quarterbacks because I think that Steve Sarkisian knows that he has to play Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning. It doesn't matter what capacity Arch Manning is playing, he has to play. He has to have some sort of role, some sort of drive, some sort of package, whatever it is, because Quinn Ewers has shown that he's not necessarily going to be the guy on a consistent basis. I think that he's still the starter, but I think you've seen that there's a need for Arch Manning to kind of switch up the pace, give the defense more to prepare for, because if you only play one quarterback, they only have to worry about one guy. You don't necessarily have to prepare for Arch, but they're going to. Clemson is going to have to worry about what does Arch Manning do. You give that running element when Arch is in the game, so how do they prepare to stop that? That's going to be a thing. We've seen Quinn be turnover prone. We've seen him kind of, I wouldn't say see ghosts, but Georgia definitely made him look bad at times, and Clemson has the talent to do that. Now, for the offense for Clemson, you have to worry about a ton of talent. Everything starts up front. A guy who is going to have a really, really good career is Colin Simmons, an explosive defensive end who's really playing strong as of late, and that's the right time to get your freshman to play at a high level. Getting after Cade Klubnik is something that this Texas team wants to do, and it's up to Clemson's offensive line to slow them down. Anthony Hill Jr. is a really good linebacker for this group. You also have Vernon Broughton, who's, again, really stepped up as of late. Simmons and Broughton are two guys that are going to be a nightmare to stop, and it's a matter of how do you scheme guys open to negate some of that talent? How do you get certain blitzes, certain twists, all that kind of stuff to work in your favor where you have openings and you find openings in the defense where you can make explosive plays. Clemson has a lot of work to do, but they have opportunities to see what worked for other teams against this Texas team and how do we use that. I think people are kind of forgetting, even though Texas is the 5 seed, they don't really have the strongest schedule that tells you that you should be really, really worried if you're Clemson. There are definitely opportunities. I'm not saying it's easy, but there are opportunities for Clemson to pull off this upset. If they're able to follow that blueprint, they're finding ways to gash this Texas defense, and they're finding confidence, then I feel really excited about what Clemson could do in this game.